Mom taught us one rule: always check for your shadow. Every few hours, the three of us, Mom, Curly, and me, would do a shadow check. It was as second nature as taking a sip of water. "Shadow check," my mom would call, and we'd both look down, checking that our shadow was still there. I thought everyone did this. We were homeschooled, so no one really told me otherwise. And my one friend down the block, Samantha, was a little strange herself, so she never seemed to notice. But then Mom got a job, and Curly and I went to school, and that's when everything collapsed. "What are you doing?" Paige asked me as we stood outside for recess one cool fall afternoon. "Shadow check," I replied. "Duh." "Shadow check?" she asked, confused. "What's that?" I squinted at her. "You don't know what a shadow check is?" It was like she told me she didn't know how to brush her teeth. I explained, slowly in simple terms, like I was talking to a baby. "You look at the ground to check your shadow is still there." She obediently looked at the ground. "There it is!" Then she raised her arms out in front of her and linked them, making her shadow look like the letter P. "Look! It's like P! For Paige!" In no time at all, half of the class was doing it. We'd bound out for recess, and someone would shout, "Shadow check!" The kids would contort their bodies into weird shapes to make their shadows look like elephants or cats or letters, and we'd try to guess what they were. That went on nicely for about 3 days. Then, horror struck. On Thursday afternoon, it was overcast. "Shadow check!" Thomas shouted. I diligently looked down and saw my shadow, but when I looked up I realized nobody else had a shadow. For a second I wanted to panic and scream and run, but then I took a deep breath and did exactly what my mom taught me. I grabbed Paige first. "Hey!" she protested, but I didn't listen. I held on with a vice grip and started pulling her back towards the school. When the shadow goes away, hide in darkness for a day. The mantra echoed in my head. The school had a basement. I'd heard the teachers mention it. The basement would be safe. All we had to do was stay there until the morning. "Let go of me!" Paige screeched, finally yanking her wrist out of my grasp. "What's wrong with you?" "What's wrong with you?" I screamed back. "We have to hide!" The kids weren't smiling anymore. They were staring at me, backing away like I was a rabid animal. "We have to hide!" I screamed again. "All the shadows are gone!" I grabbed at Paige again, but she dodged this time. I lost my footing and fell onto the asphalt. Pain stung my knees. I looked up at my classmates. Why aren't they hiding? "What are you doing? Run!" I screamed. That's when a teacher helped me up and took me right to the principal's office. "I should have explained more clearly," my mother told that night as she tucked me in. "The shadow thing is only for us. It's okay if other people don't have shadows." "Why?" Sadness flashed across her face for a second. Then she shook her head. "That's just the way it is. No one talked to me at recess anymore, not even Paige. I sat alone all the time. I noticed now that there were many days, and some classrooms even, when people didn't have shadows. I always did, but they didn't. Months passed, and eventually kids forgot about the incident. That's what kids do. Forget. Sometimes I wish forgiving and forgetting came easier to adults. Paige would run up to me at recess and we'd play hopscotch. She never brought up the fact that even on an overcast day, my shadow still danced across the chalk lines, mirroring my own movements. Except sometimes they were the slightest bit out of sync, like my shadow was moving on a split-second delay. As I got older, however, things got more complicated. In 7th grade science, the teacher taught us about the sun and optics and light, prisms and rainbows and the cones and rods in our eyes, and she mentioned that our shadow was just the absence of light, that our bodies were blocking out the sun or the overhead fluorescent lights. It didn't make sense to me then that my shadow, or anyone else's, would be able to disappear. If the lighting didn't change, and I didn't move, how could a shadow suddenly disappear? Curly was now old enough to insist we called her by her real name, but she was still too young to understand the argument I had with my mom that night. "It's not possible," I shouted as she worked on her coloring book upstairs. "You're lying to me." "I'm not lying to you," my mother pleaded. "Yes, you are." I ran across the living room to get in my mom's face, walked right past the ornate glass lamp that stood on the end table. My mom's eyes widened. She looked at the ground. And that's when I realized my shadow was gone. The lamp was behind me. My shadow should have been on the floor in front of me, but it wasn't. "Run!" she whispered. When I didn't move, she began to shout, "Go to Curly! Go!" I hesitated for half a second. Then I sprinted for the stairs. "Turn off the light!" she shouted after me. I darted in and closed to the door. Then I bent down and yanked out the plug to the lamp. "Hey," Curly said. "I'm coloring." "Shh," I whispered. "What?" My shadow disappeared. Curly was too young to remember the day her shadow disappeared. She'd only been a year old. Mom had scooped her out of the playpen, grabbed me by the hand, and took the three of us into the basement. We spent the night down there in total darkness, eating canned beans and sleeping on old comforters laid out on the cement floor. But she knew that it was bad. She scrambled over to her bed and pulled the covers over her head. I stood in the center of the room, listening for Mom's footsteps. They never came. Is she staying down there? But we had so many lights on down there. It would be safer to just run to us. I crept towards the door, my heart pounding, slipping over the Barbies Curly had all over the floor. "Mom?" I called out through the door. Nothing. I opened the door just a crack and peered out. I could see the stairs, the light spilling out from the living room, but everything was silent. Maybe she went into the basement. Maybe. A shadow appeared, cast across the wall. No. She's still down there? But no. That couldn't be my mom's shadow. It was too short. And even though the edges were blurry, the shadow sort of looked like it had a ponytail. Not a short hair and a pixie cut, like my mom. That's not Mom. That's me. The blurry edges sharpened. And then the figure, the shadow, came into view. My ponytail, my upturned nose, my knock-knees. The thing crouched down and pulled at something, yanking it, moving completely independent of me. A dragging sound. My mother's feet came into view, still and lifeless. I gasped, my hand clapped to my mouth, but it was too late. The shadow froze, turned to stare directly at me, and then with huge, loping strides it started up the stairs. I slammed the door shut, clicked the lock. Then I jumped under the covers with Curly, my entire body trembling. The police never found Mom's body. She was eventually declared legally dead. Curly and I were sent away to live with our grandparents. They didn't seem to know anything about the shadow. They never asked us to do shadow checks. The only remark in 10 years was my grandma, on a particularly cloudy day, remarking how strange it was that I cast a perfect shadow on the sidewalk in front of us. I watched it as I walked, and noticed its movements weren't perfectly in sync with my own. As the years went by and my shadow didn't disappear again, I started to get complacent. I checked for it less and less frequently. I started to lead a normal life, getting hired as a real estate agent. Curly, now going by her name Rebecca, is 19 and in college. I even started to persuade myself that my shadow didn't kill her, that my mom ran away after our fight, and my memory of the shadow was my way of coping with it, because it was harder to accept my mom had abandoned us than it was to accept an evil shadow had killed her. That's what I told myself. Until tonight. As I sat down on my computer to finish writing a house listing, I noticed there was no shadow of my fingers on the keyboard, no shadow on the linoleum under the desk. I ran to turn off all the lights, but I don't think I was fast enough. because when I ran to close the blinds to block out the light from the street lamp below, I saw my shadow walking across the dark street, disappearing into the night. So please, I beg you, if you see any strange shadows in your home or outside, something you don't think is cast by the lights, by the objects in your home, something that looks different, hide, somewhere pitch dark, where no shadows can be cast until morning. I'm a 17-year-old girl who would babysit for a family I knew extremely well. My younger sister was friends with the little boy from the family. We'll call him Chris for privacy reasons. I absolutely adored Chris's younger sister Lily, which is the main reason their mother had asked me to babysit for them. I was honestly excited as I really enjoyed spending time with both kids. Their mom was going out to dinner with friends, and she wouldn't be home until much later in the night. The night of babysitting approached, and everything had been fine. I'd been playing some Minecraft with the two of them for quite a while, and later ordered a pizza for us all to share. Eventually, 9 p.m. approached, and it was the kids' bedtime. The excitement must have wiped them out because they didn't fight me at all. Once they were both asleep in their rooms, I sat on the couch in the living room and watched Netflix. For context, behind the living room is the staircase which leads to upstairs. So from where I was sitting, even though my back was facing it, I could see if someone was standing on the staircase. I was about halfway into an episode of my show when I then heard footsteps descending down the stairs. Assuming it was either Chris or Lily, I called out both of their names. No answer. Either I imagined it, or it was just one of them getting up to use the bathroom or something. I continued to watch my show until I saw something in the reflection of the grandfather clock. Right next to the TV, there was a faint outline of a little girl leaning over the railing of the stairs. I wasn't panicked at all initially, as I figured it was just Lily who had woken up. I turned from the couch to look at the stairs, only to be met with an empty staircase. There was nobody there. I whipped my head back around to face the grandfather clock, and the reflection was gone. I felt my stomach plummet and my heartbeat started to spike. Unnerved, I paused the TV and looked back at the staircase. Nothing. Maybe the reflection had just been from the TV and this was all in my head. That was the only plausible explanation. The only way I was going to find out for sure was if I checked both kids. Reluctantly, I got up and I walked up the staircase. I opened the door to Chris's room to find him sound asleep. I then made my way over to Lily's room, only to find her asleep as well. I walked further into her room just to double-check if she was really fully asleep, and she was. My heart still racing. I was just baffled. What the hell had I seen in the reflection if Lily was genuinely asleep? I turned to leave the room only to stop dead in my tracks. There was a girl standing in the hallway, a girl who definitely wasn't Lily. She was sickeningly pale and wearing a white nightgown. I felt like my heart was going to come up my throat, frozen in fear. It took a few seconds to come back to reality and then slam the door and lock it. My heart is pounding so fiercely I feel like I'm going to puke. I just stood there, leaning against the door for a solid minute, heart racing and breathing heavy. That's when I then heard a knock on the door, and I jumped screaming bloody murder. "Hey, it's just me," I heard Chris say from the other side of the door. Instant relief washed over me as I opened the door to see Chris. He just stood there, eyes wide, with this absolutely unnerved expression, clutching his little creeper-stuffed animal. "What's wrong?" he asked me quietly. Lily had woken up as well, sitting up in bed with a confused expression. I didn't want to scare either of them, and little kids will panic if they see an adult actually freaked out. So I lied. Was just watching a scary movie downstairs, I tell them. When I came up to check on you guys, I guess I was just caught off guard. Sorry for waking you. They both went back to bed, and I returned back downstairs to try and become calm again. I resumed my TV show, and I was reaching the end when I suddenly had the urge to look in the reflection once again. Big mistake. I looked back only to see the clear face of a young girl, the one from the hallway, gaunt black eyes boring straight into me. Without another thought, I immediately sprung off the couch and sprinted up the stairs. I scooped Lily up out of bed and yanked Chris out of his. I fumbled for my car keys out of my bag, my hands shaking and my mind yelling a million different things at me. I booked it for my car. I don't even remember if I looked down the driveway before peeling out and speeding towards my home. Chris and Lily slept in the guest room in my house that night. I texted the mother that their house had lost power that night, so I had taken them to mine. My family was super close to theirs, so I didn't think it would be a big deal. When she came to pick them up, their mother asked me to babysit again, but I turned her down politely. It's not that I didn't like the kids. There was just no way in hell I was going to deal with that again. A few weeks later, my sister was invited for a playdate with Chris. My parents, their mom and I were all eating lunch together when Chris and Lily's mom brought up she was looking into moving. She started to complain, hearing weird noises and seeing things by the staircase. Shock hit me like a bucket of cold water. Their mom continued on, explaining that she went to go do research on the house and had come across some unsettling things. During the 1920s, a family with 2 daughters lived there. Their youngest had died of pneumonia, and her bedroom was Lily's. Previous owners of the house had complained of the same things. I wasn't crazy, but I would be if I ever went back into that house again. When I was a kid, well, a young teenager, I frequently spent my Saturday nights babysitting my siblings. As the eldest of 3, I assumed this responsibility with no pay nor thanks to speak of. It was simply expected of me, one of my contributions to the family. I babysat so frequently because, well, my parents needed it. They'd had marriage problems in the past, and their counselor told them they should go on a weekly date. You know, revive the magic, rekindle the flame, all that good stuff. Yeah, it sucked to be robbed of a weekend evening, but it wasn't much of a burden. My parents were happier than they'd been in ages, and they both seemed genuinely excited for date night each week. I would have rather been doing other things, of course, but I'd seen my aunt and uncle go through a nasty divorce a few years back, and I desperately wanted my parents to stick together. And so it was that on the night of December 3rd, in the year 2006, I stood at the open front door of my secluded Colorado home, waving goodbye as my parents backed out of the icy driveway. "Drive safe," I called out, steam pouring from my mouth. I don't know if they heard me or not. Wrapping my arms around my torso in response to the wintry mountain air, I entertained myself for a few brief moments by exhaling forcefully and watching my breath float away into nothing. And there was truly nothing around me. Not a car or a creature in sight. It wasn't long before I grew bored and turned back into the warm house, nose tingling from the chill. Georgie and Kate were eating their dinner at the kitchen table. As I watched them, I couldn't help feeling like an only child. Georgie, 3 years my junior, was severely autistic and not talkative. He only spoke when he really wanted something, and only then in the simplest of words. Milk and sandwich was code for peanut butter and jelly with the crust cut off, which he was presently devouring. Kate, meanwhile, was still a baby, just shy of 2. The 9-year gap between them is glaring, but to this day, my parents swear to me Kate wasn't an accident. Kind of like back in high school, when I swore to them I had no idea how those magazines got under my mattress. But I digress. The kids finished dinner, and I set them up with their entertainment for the night. Georgie in his room with the PlayStation 2, which was a hot commodity in those days, and Kate in her crib in front of Sesame Street. Myself, I ignited the basement fireplace, dimmed the overheads, and curled up with a book by the light of our Christmas tree. God, that was a nice house. Not a day goes by that I don't miss it. I read in perfect contentment for nearly an hour. Night had fallen by then, and the room had become toasty. I was beginning to doze off when I heard Georgie's heavy footfalls descending the staircase. I sat upright and looked at him expectantly as he waddled into the room. "No more knocking," he said, brow furrowed in annoyance. I shook my head. "I'm not knocking," I said. "Is someone at the door?" Georgie just stared at me blankly. "Georgie," I said more clearly this time, "did someone knock on the door?" "No more knocking," he repeated. "Knocking on window." Knocking on window? I stood up now, wide awake. "Georgie, is someone knocking on your window?" "No more," he replied simply. I stood in silence for a moment, unsure of what to do. It was probably just one of my friends playing a prank, I thought, but being alone in a house that big makes you a little jumpy. My mind started to race through the situation. I was a 13-year-old boy in a nice house on the hilly outskirts of a Colorado mountain town. The streets were engulfed in trees, and there were no homes within a quarter-mile of my own. Our road saw next to no traffic, and the police station was a good 15 minutes away. It was probably my friends, I thought, but what if it wasn't? "Follow me," I told Georgie. Hand trembling slightly, I turned the knob and glanced up the staircase. It was dark up there. The only light came from Kate's room. Kate. I sprinted up the stairs to her room, where she remained happily perched in her crib, squawking with delight as Elmo fiddled with his crayons. I breathed a sigh of relief, but still, my heart thumped in my chest. "This is silly," I told myself. "Be a man." I made my way down the hall to Georgie's room and stood tentatively at its door. Taking a deep breath, I gently pushed the door ajar, reaching for the light switch and thinking better of it. If this was the worst-case scenario, then I didn't want our mystery intruder to know where in the house I was. The only light in the room came from Star Wars, Battlefront's game-paused screen. I listened for a moment, but heard nothing. I began to suspect that Georgie had simply imagined the knocking. Somewhat exasperatedly, I moved to the window and flicked up a blind to reveal nothing. Just a landscape of freshly fallen snow backed by a quiet, lonely road. I watched the peaceful night, relieved, as the large flakes fell softly to the ground, my eyes trailing an individual fractal all the way to the footprints just beneath the window's frame. At first, I did not comprehend them. I just stared, transfixed, at the deep imprints in the snow. Shoes. A man's shoes. None of my friends wore the size, of that I felt sure. I traced them backwards from the window to the sidewalk, from whence this intruder had evidently come. But where did they lead? It was a bright night. The moon shone proudly between the clouds. My eyes followed the steps across the front yard, but once they passed behind the giant pine, they disappeared. My heart leapt to my throat. Whoever had walked behind that tree was still there. In panic, I quickly backed away from the window. Georgie, sensing my fear, began to whimper. "No, no, no, shh," I muttered, desperate to keep him quiet. I flicked the television off and led Georgie out of the room. I quickly pulled Kate from her crib, powered her TV down as well, and carried her down the stairs in the blackness. "Can't see," Georgie said, and Kate began to cry. I shushed her hurriedly as we descended. Once in the basement den, I unplugged the Christmas tree so that the only light in the room came from the embers of the dying fire. I sat Georgie down on the couch and settled Kate in his arms. "Sit right here," I directed, staring into his eyes. "Don't move. Do you understand? Do not move." I need to call the police. I would have called my parents, but this was 10 years ago and they didn't have cell phones. So I took the stairs quickly and quietly, tiptoeing to the phone hanging from the wall of our living room. I picked up the phone and dialed 911, but I heard nothing. Silence. I slammed it on the receiver and picked it up again. Again. Nothing. I think it was around this point that I started to cry. I couldn't help it. I was scared. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that the storm had killed the phone line, but there wasn't much of a storm. The snow was steady, sure, but there wasn't even a breeze. Certainly nothing that could have disabled our phone. Tentatively, I walked into Kate's room and peeked out the window. My first glance was toward the tree, of course, where the footprints stopped, but now they continued. Sometime while I was herding my siblings downstairs, whoever was behind the tree had moved. I followed the footsteps across my frozen front yard to a man standing near the driveway. He was looking right at me. My breath stopped. I was frozen in place. This was not one of my friends. I had never seen this man before, but he was looking at me with an eerie blankness. He was wearing a black turtleneck and black slacks, a lone dark spot on a blanket of purest white. My eyes never left him, and his never left me. We stood still, silently staring, for what seemed like an eternity. My heart thrummed in my chest, and I felt nauseous. For the first time, gazing into this man's eyes from afar, I began to consider the possibility of my death. I thought of my dad's brother, who was killed in an accident at age 11. Forever 11, never growing up, frozen in time in the memories of all who knew him, as a soul of eternal youth. At this, the tears flowed freely once more. "Please don't hurt us," I begged in a sobbing whisper. I knew he could not hear me, but I could not help myself. Finally, he broke eye contact with me and looked toward the heavens, toward the gently falling snow. He was saying something, but what, I could not hear. I stared, transfixed, as he pulled a handful of dark powder from his pocket. Then, still gazing upward, still muttering to himself, he flung the stuff at his feet. I desperately wanted to run to get my siblings, but I thought that to let this man out of my sight would be unconscionably foolish. No, better to keep an eye on him. The house was still locked. I had the upper hand, I felt. Besides, I could not bring myself to look away from the strange ritual unfolding before me. The man had removed his sweater and flung it carelessly to the ground behind him. He was no longer staring skyward, but his lips continued to move. I trained my eyes intently upon his mouth, trying with no success to read his words, when I saw something glint in the moonlight. It was a knife, a long callous blade, which he had removed from his other pocket. It bore dark stains already. From what? I covered my mouth to hush a scream as the man, still muttering to himself, ran the edge of the blade along his pale, distended stomach. A thin red line appeared along his abdomen, and blood of the deepest shade began to dribble from the wound. The streams trickled down his belly and fell ungracefully upon the black powder at his feet. At this, the man stared skyward once more, face contorted in a gruesome smile. He was sobbing uncontrollably, and mucus ran freely from his nostrils. But he looked happy, beyond happy, elated. My stomach churned in revulsion. This man was in ecstasy. I watched, almost entranced by this bizarre unfolding, when the man's face changed suddenly. He looked directly at me once more, and his eyes appeared unhinged. Still clutching the knife, he began to sprint directly at my window. I took one look at the weapon this man brandished and instinctively fled the room. I slammed the door shut behind me and was halfway down the stairs when I heard the window shatter. The man screamed loudly in pain as I reached the basement. I locked the door behind me and ran to Georgie and Kate. "No more screaming," Georgie pleaded. "No more screaming," I agreed in hushed tones, stroking his hair in an effort to calm him down. Kate, meanwhile, seemed happy as a clam. I strained, listening intently. Is he inside the house? I still clung to some naive hope that he had injured himself on the glass and had retreated, or perhaps he had been weakened by his self-inflicted wound. Finally, I heard it. The subtle but unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. He was indeed inside the house, and by the sound of it, was trying to be quiet. I silently guided Georgie and Kate into a storage closet and closed the door behind us, manipulating the handle to make as little noise as possible. We stayed there for about 5 minutes, listening to the ceiling creak threateningly above us. Then I realized, I don't know why it took me so long, that we were not trapped. We still had a way out. I saw in my mind's eye a window well in the bathroom down the hall, the only access our basement had to the outside world. Almost as if on cue, a frustrated scream echoed from above, followed by a tremendous crash. He had pulled something to the ground, perhaps the entertainment stand or maybe the hutch. "He's here!" the man shrieked hysterically. "How dare you hide from him?" To this day, I don't know who he was talking about, but it was at that moment, the moment I heard him begin to descend the stairs, that I made my move. Holding Kate in one arm and guiding Georgie with the other, we began our flight down the hallway. As we reached the bathroom, I stared fixedly at the window near the ceiling. It would be a tight fit, but we could make it. I flung the window open, stood on the toilet, and placed Kate gently in the shallow window well. Then I stepped off and told Georgie to get on. "Yucky gross, no standing on toilet," he said, looking embarrassed. I heard the man fumble with the locked handle at the base of the stairs. Time was running out. I'm not proud of what I did next, but it was the only way I could think of to get Georgie to cooperate. I smacked my brother roughly across the face and grabbed him by the shirt with both hands. "Georgie, get on the fucking toilet!" I snarled at him, the first time I had ever said that word. He began to wail in pain and surprise, but he did step onto the toilet all the same. "Climb out the window," I directed in a harsh tone, and as he grabbed the ledge, I used all the strength I could muster to help push him up. Once he almost slipped back down, almost, but he was stronger than I thought he was, and managed to pull himself back up. With both of my siblings safely in the window well, I climbed on the toilet one last time and gripped the edge of the windowsill. As I clambered out myself, I heard a raucous crash. The man had broken down the basement door. With one last hoist, I pulled my legs up through the window and shut it quietly behind me. As I helped my siblings out of the well, I heard one last anguished shout from the man, muffled through the pane of glass. "Why are you hiding from him?" "Cold!" screamed Georgie as I led him barefoot through the snowy grass. In panic, I shushed him, but it was no use. He and Kate were both crying quite loudly by this point. My only hope was to get them as far away from the house as possible. I heard a distant crash from inside the house, and I quickened our pace. Feet numb, I sprinted through the yard to the sidewalk, and practically had to drag Georgie onto it. "Bathroom light on," he said pleadingly. He was obsessive about turning off lights and electronics before leaving, and he was correct. We had left the bathroom light on in our haste. I ignored him and rushed us down the frozen pavement, stepping on sharp rocks and sticks and not even comprehending it. Adrenaline surged through my veins. I didn't know what we were headed toward. All I knew is what we were headed away from. The snow was falling much harder by this point. I could already see it collecting in a pile on Kate's head. Her nose was beet red and dripping with snot. I needed to get her inside. But where? I looked ahead and saw a light, off in the distance. The Garland's house. I'd said maybe a grand total of 6 words to Mr. and Mrs. Garland my entire life, but that was our one option. It was in their house that we would seek refuge. My house was now around the corner and out of sight, but I did not let up the pace until Georgie tripped on something and landed in a dark puddle. "Hey!" he screamed indignantly, looking back at his stumbling block. In the glow of the distant streetlight, I could see Georgie had fallen into blood. A dead man lay, face up and eyes open, on the sidewalk. Snow had fallen onto most of him, and he had been mostly invisible until Georgie's feet had connected with his midsection. I remembered the dark stain I had seen on our intruder's knife. "Come on," I pled, wrenching my eyes away from the grisly scene as I pulled Georgie to his feet. We ran for another 60 seconds maybe, and finally reached the Garlands' front door. The window into their parlor was open and a fire was roaring. Mr. and Mrs. Garland sat, drinking tea in cozy armchairs. I pounded ferociously on their door. They answered together, utter bewilderment stamped on their faces. I handed Kate to Mrs. Garland and collapsed into tears. The police arrived at my home 15 minutes later and apprehended the man unconscious, lying in a crumpled heap on the floor of our basement bathroom. They discovered him with a fractured skull, many deep lacerations from the window of Kate's room, and intestines partially protruding from the wound on his gut. He had slipped in his attempt to climb where we had climbed, hit his head, and knocked himself out. Apparently, he confessed under questioning that he was a member of a strange cult, a cult which, as far as anyone can tell, does not even exist. He claimed to have been taking part in a ritual which required the sacrifice of a pure soul, and my autistic brother had been his target that night. My parents have not shared with me all the details of what happened after that night, but as far as I know, our intruder is currently rotting in a cell. The man he killed, the man lying on the sidewalk, was a friend of my father who lived 2 streets over. He had called his wife on his cell phone not long before he died, informing her of a suspicious man dressed in black, stalking around the neighborhood. My parents arrived home from their date to find police swarmed around the block and their home a crime scene. My father relocated at work, and we had moved across the Rockies to Salt Lake City just 2 weeks later. Kate is now a bratty middle schooler. As far as I'm concerned, she's perfect. Georgie, now 21, hasn't changed a bit, but he loses his mind if someone knocks on a window. As for me, I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie now. I climb mountains with narrow trails and steep ridges. I go cave diving in places where you shouldn't. All, I think, in an attempt to recreate the fearful intensity of that one snowy night long ago. But it never works. The closest I come is when I'm alone, in my room, in the dead of night. Then, and then alone, is when the real fear sets in. When someone you love just disappears, it messes with your entire life. For me, it was my 13-year-old brother David. I loved my older brother so much. We were living in a small farm town in the Pennsylvania countryside. At that time, we were living in one of the oldest houses in town. Our house was built sometime in the late 1700s. On the night he went missing, I remember my parents weren't home that night for whatever reason. But back in the 80s, it was considered okay to leave your kids home alone. Me and my brother were both sitting on the floor in the living room, listening to the radio broadcast. My brother asked me to fill him a glass of Hawaiian punch. After I went to the kitchen and poured him a glass, he had completely vanished from the living room. I remember that exact moment as clear as day. I thought he was playing a trick on me. I played along, but when I searched every room in that damn house, not a hair was out of place. He couldn't have gone outside because I was by the front door the whole time, and the windows were sealed shut since by the previous owner. The basement door in the living room was wide open. the only place he could have gone. When I left to fill up his drink, it was shut. I was horrified of the basement as a kid because there's no electricity down there and it literally looked like a dungeon. I yelled his name from the top of the stairs countless times, but he never answered. Even though I was 11, that basement still scared me. I remember that night, sobbing uncontrollably, and when my parents finally pulled into the driveway the next morning, I was still in tears when I told them about David. Mom and Dad checked the whole house. I then told Dad about how the basement door was wide open, and when he walked down into the basement. I remember sitting on the couch next to the basement door, hoping my dad would walk back up with David, but when Dad walked up those stairs, his face had gone completely pale. In his hands were my brother's clothes from the night before. I can't describe how horrified I was. He dropped them onto the ground and walked upstairs to where Mom was. I then got on the ground and crawled toward the clothes, exactly what my brother was wearing before he disappeared. I sorted through them. Everything he wore that night, shirt, pants, underwear, socks, everything stripped from him. I could hear my parents' voices from upstairs. My mother then came sprinting down the stairs and got on the phone with the police. My dad ran outside and into the field. When the police finally arrived, the entire police team thought he must have gone outside and got lost in the nearby forest. But I knew for a fact he was in that house. The police officers spent weeks searching the woods and fields near our house. The police checked the basement but said there was nothing. They closed the case about a half a year later. The entire town assumed it was a kidnapping. I knew it was something to do with that basement, but I could never get myself to go down there. After his disappearance, life continued for our family. We turned David's bedroom into a guest bedroom. I hated how my parents did that. It felt like they were trying to move on. I was unable to. Losing David was a huge damper over my entire family, something that would hang over our heads our entire lives. Mom's way of coping with the grief was just erasing all memory of him. I hated her guts for that. Every time I looked at that basement door growing up, I could feel something behind it. I remember one day when I was 16, I was putting DVDs away in the living room. I was sitting a few feet away from that door, and I smelt something familiar. The smell was seeping through the cracks of the door. It was what my brother smelt like. I got up and nearly ripped that door off the hinges. I ran downstairs into the darkness. The entire room smelt like David's old bedroom. It was pitch black, but I knew he was in there. I started screaming his name. I screamed his name for hours until Dad finally came down. Dad couldn't smell it. He thought I was insane. I remember I couldn't talk for weeks after that. Nowadays, the 30-year anniversary of David's disappearance is rolling around. I can say it's been a long 30 years without him. I'm now living alone an hour or so away from my childhood town. I had to get out of there as soon as possible. When I turned 18, I started looking toward apartments in town, and by my 20th birthday, I was out the door. My parents continued to live in that house. My mom developed stage 3 breast cancer about 3 years ago and was forced into a group home closer to the hospital. My father was given the option to move with her and sell the home, but he decided to stay there and continue farming. My mother and father had a tough relationship ever since I left the house, so Dad didn't mind the quiet. Later on, my dad fell off his tractor and broke his knee, and is now unable to walk without a cane. He then moved in with Mom, then sold me the land for free, and insisted that I moved back into that house. I wanted nothing to do with that house. I had to pay taxes for that house on top of my own taxes. I then allowed tenants move in. They were a young couple, late 20s. Of course, my stubborn old man was angry with me for letting a desperate couple live in the vacant house. They've been living in that house for almost a year now, and they called me up last week complaining about a decaying smell coming from the basement. By that time, I had learned to adapt from David's death. I told them I'd check it out the next morning. That was the biggest mistake of my life. I woke up early the next morning and drove to the house. It felt odd driving back there. Those fields, it all felt so familiar. I tried not to think about how scared I was of that basement growing up. Fortunately, my dad finally added electricity down in the basement. I pulled into the driveway. They were both waiting outside for me. They said it smelt like something was rotting down there. I had everything I'd be needing: asbestos masks, medical gloves, eye protection. I worked as an air duct cleaner a few years ago, so I have some background knowledge. I walked into the house and headed for the basement door. I never seen what it actually looked like down there until now. I opened the door and could immediately smell it. Something was rotting in there. I turned on the light switch. Ahead of me was an empty room. It was small, looked to be about 15 by 10 feet big. This basement had been haunting me for all these years. Seeing it with the lights on felt off. The walls were stone, except for one. One of the walls stood out. It was wood instead of stone. The smell was clearly coming from the wood. The wood was rotting. I walked over and I thought the best idea would be just to tear the whole wall down. I started tearing pieces of rotten wood off the walls. Light started to seep into the other side. There was a secret room in the basement. I stopped, and in front of me I saw what looked like human flesh. I couldn't describe how horrified I was. I would rather go to hell than relive that terrible moment. I started smashing that wall with all the force in my body until it finally gave in. The creature in front of me, just the sight of it made me want to claw my eyes out. It was in a fetal position. The skin wasn't pale, it was white, and it looked like the flesh had been melted to the bones. The fingernails and toenails stretched halfway across the room. The worst part was that it wasn't dead. It was breathing. It was alive. "David," I said in a terrified voice. It slowly lifted its head and looked at me. The face looked completely mutated, but those eyes were my brother's eyes. It tried to speak. It tried with everything in it. That thing was my brother David. I had so many questions. How was he alive? What did he eat? How could he breathe? What the fuck happened? I kept the questions to myself. That was my brother in that basement. This whole time he's been in that fucking basement. I didn't say another word to him. I ran upstairs and out to my car. I opened up my glove box and grabbed my gun. By the time I got downstairs, David had stood up, dragging his long nails behind him. "Julian," he growled. I then shot him in the head. At the top of the stairs were the tenants questioning the gunshot. They walked down the stairs to investigate. By the time I heard them scream, I was already out the door and backing out of their driveway. I didn't shoot David because I was scared of him. I shot him because of how awful the situation was. That was 2 days ago. I've been driving ever since. The only time I stopped was to fill my gas tank. I don't know where the hell I am. Last time I checked, it said I was in Kansas. I don't know what to do. Should I join Davis in the afterlife, or should I try to move on? The most sickening thing is not knowing what happened. What the fuck happened? I keep asking myself. What the hell happened? I grew up in a challenging environment. My mother left my father when I was very young, and we were left in a difficult situation. My father had to work 2 jobs to make enough money to pay our monthly rent, which meant he was rarely home. As a result, from the age of about 8, I was often left on my own, practically raising myself until I eventually left home for college. Luckily, I was granted a scholarship which allowed me to go to college. I spent my college years studying wildlife biology, a lifelong interest of mine. I was always fascinated by the way animals survived and thrived with each other. After years of hard work, I finally earned my master's degree in wildlife. I started looking for available jobs in my area, but couldn't find any within 30 miles of my hometown. Eventually, I did find a position opening in the town of Dallas, Texas. I was pleasantly surprised to find out that I possibly wouldn't have to move out of state if I landed this job. So I sent in an application, and the next day I was asked to have an interview. A few days later, I took the drive up to Dallas and interviewed with the company. They told me they would be glad to employ me, and I gratefully accepted the offer. I took the time up in Dallas to look around for homes in the area, and I eventually settled on an apartment complex in downtown Dallas. A few months later, I made the move. The apartment was small, but just enough for a man in his bed. I lived my life happily in that apartment for 3 long years before I decided to propose to my girlfriend Sarah. She said yes, and we got married a few months later. We eventually moved out of the tiny apartment and bought a small house. Fast forward a few years, and we have 2 beautiful baby girls, and are both stressed out. The traffic of the area was too much to be driving in every day with 3 screaming kids in the back, and the house was getting cramped. We decided that we couldn't take this lifestyle anymore, so we made the executive decision to move somewhere more peaceful. I wanted to keep my job, so we only moved a couple of miles away to the town of Mansfield. It was only about a 20-30 minutes drive from my office and provided a much more laid-back city experience. We bought a beautiful home in a gated community off of the highway with the help of my wife's parents. The neighborhood was small and maybe had 30 homes inside of it. All of the homes were lovely large houses with pretty large trees in their yards, perfect for me as a nature enthusiast. We eventually moved into the house and our kids loved it. Our neighbors probably hated it. We never got to know one of our neighbors, but the other neighbors were extremely kind. They were an elderly couple who had never had kids. They eventually became adopted grandparents to our kids and were thought of as family. Like I said, the kids loved the house, and so did my wife and I. The house had 4 bedrooms and a large living room and kitchen. There was also a pool and hot tub in the backyard which overlooked the creek that went behind our house. The creek was called Hogpen Branch, and it ran throughout the town and emptied into Walnut Creek. The river was small and was only about 4 feet deep behind our house. Every once in a while we would go watch the turtles swim around, and my daughters loved it. A few years passed, and my daughters were finally old enough to be left alone, which meant I had time to finally learn how to golf. Just across the creek was a really nice golf course. After a few weeks of playing, we invested the money to buy a golf cart. It wasn't the fanciest, but just enough to get you around the course. One night during the summer, my wife decided to take the girls out on a girls' night. Of course, being the 6-year-olds they were, they rubbed it in my face. I went along with it and acted super jealous. However, I was excited to have the house to myself for a night. I eventually decided to go golfing before the sunset. It was probably 6 o'clock or so I still had plenty of time. I got ready to leave the house and hopped in the golf cart. In order to get to the greens, you had to drive down the street and go through a little alley nestled between 2 houses. It was a short drive before you got to the cart path, which had a little bridge running over Hogpen Branch. This was where I had my first strange occurrence. As I was going over the bridge, I heard a splash. With me being the nature lover I am, I jumped out of my cart and leaned over the edge trying to see what was there. To my surprise, there was nothing there. Unlike the creek further upstream, it was fairly clear here. Not anything like the waters of Florida, but I could see the bottom. But there was nothing there. Not a fish, not a turtle, not anything. However, I didn't mind it. All I could focus on was golf at the time, so I dismissed it as someone skipping stones upstream. I golfed for maybe 2 hours before it got too dark to see the ball. I packed up my clubs and began to take the drive back home. The pathway was long and took me a good 5 minutes to drive down. I was starving and planned on cooking burgers for myself later that night. As I was driving along the trail, I noticed a few balls someone had forgotten to get out of the sand trap. I needed some more balls, so I went to retrieve them. As I bent over to pick up the golf balls, I heard a loud shriek. I glanced in the direction of the noise and saw nothing except for trees and the bridge in the distance. I stared in the direction looking for maybe an injured animal. I initially thought it could have been a fox cry due to its distinct sound of a human scream. Eventually, a thought clicked in my head. I had thought that there was possibly an animal struggling that could have fallen in the water when I heard the splash. Though it had been a while since I heard the noise, foxes are known to be strong swimmers. I jumped in my cart and sped over to the bridge, which was maybe 100 yards away, hoping to be able to save an animal's life. However, when I arrived at the bridge, there was nothing there. I searched under the bridge and all around the area, but there was nothing. I thought it was odd, but dismissed it and hopped back into my cart. I drove home and cleaned up. By the time I had showered and gotten ready to grill a few patties, it was already dark. I grabbed some meat from the fridge and headed outside. I cleaned off the grill and threw a few patties onto it. I put on some music and sat back and watched the flames turn the red meat brown. I stood up and walked over to flip the patties, but just as I was about to flip one, I heard a screech. The sound made me jump. I flipped the patties and walked over to the creek, only to find absolutely nothing. At this point, I was getting creeped out, so I got my finished patties off the grill and headed indoors. I made my burgers how I liked them and sat down at the dining table. The table faced the window, and I stared out at the dark yard, only illuminated by the porch lights and the blue hue of the pool's lights. I saw nothing the entire time I ate my burgers and sat in silence. My silence was only broken by the arrival of my family. They came in exhausted from their night. The kids came over to me, gave me a hug, and then went upstairs to get ready for bed. I sat at the table thinking, I probably look so creepy, as I intensely glared out the window. My thoughts were only confirmed when my wife asked, "What's wrong?" I answered her, "I'm not sure. I've just been hearing things. I thought it might have been an animal like a fox or something, but now I'm not so sure." She replied, "Well, what did it sound like?" I said, "It sounded just like a fox, which sounds sort of like a human scream. But when I looked for whatever made it, I couldn't find anything." She sort of just looked at me, then simply replied with, "Weird." We sat there for a moment before we heard one of our daughters say, "Dad, why is Mimi in the backyard?" Mimi was our neighbor, who the girls thought of as their grandma. "What?" my wife said quietly. We looked towards the yard and saw an elderly woman standing by the creek bed. The lights hardly illuminated her, but from what we could see, it was Mimi. I stood up. "Why is she out there?" Sarah said. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out," I said. I threw on my sandals and went out the back door. "Hello, Mary, are you okay? Do you need anything?" None of my questions were answered. The woman just stood there, back towards me, staring into the water. As I got closer, I noticed the awful smell of the woman. She smelled like stagnant water, a smell that smells like rotten eggs and decay. "Mary, do you need something?" My question was never answered. I then turned and walked towards the house. I met my wife in the kitchen. She was still looking out at the woman. "Maybe you should go let Bob know that she's out here," she said. "Yeah, good idea. I'll go over. You go tuck the kids in and just tell them she was looking for something," I said. She agreed, and I went to our neighbor's house. I rang the doorbell once, and Bob answered the door. He seemed excited that I was over, even though it was late at night. He told me to come in and asked if I wanted anything. "Do you want a drink or a beer or anything?" Mary can get it for you, he said. Mary then peeked her face around the corner of the kitchen. Hey, Mary, what were you looking for outside? I asked. Excuse me? She asked. You were in our backyard a couple of minutes ago. I was just wondering if you needed help finding something back there, I said. The couple went silent, then they looked over at each other. So you saw her? Bob said. Yeah, I'm not mad. I just need to know if you dropped something in the creek so I can help you get it, I said. No, honey, that wasn't me. But we know exactly who you're talking about. We call her Margaret. We see her every now and then, Mary said. Wait, so who is she? I asked. Well, that's what we're trying to find out for ourselves. We do know, however, that she is not kind. One time, Bob went out to ask her who she was, and she just screamed in his face. He fell over, and when he looked back at her, she was gone. Mary explained to me. Where are the kids? Bob asked me. They're in the house, I replied. Oh, you need to get home now, Mary told me. I didn't even question why. I just bolted out the door. I ran to our house, and when I burst in the front door, it was eerily quiet. But one horrifying detail I noticed is that the back door was wide open. I had forgotten to lock the door. You kind of grow out of the habit of locking doors at night when you live in a gated community you trust so much. Sarah! I screamed. Nobody answered. I sprinted upstairs to my daughter's room, where I found all 3 girls huddled in the closet crying. What happened? Are y'all okay? I exclaimed. She's in the house. The lady is in the house, and it's not Mary, Josh. It's not Mary. My wife cried to me. I know, I said, but it's okay. I'm here now. Just then I heard a thump from the stairs. Josh! My wife cried. At this point, my daughters were sobbing. Daddy, is she gonna hurt us? My daughter cried. No, I'm not gonna let that happen, I said confidently. I might have appeared brave to my family, but I was on the verge of tears. I heard another thump. I wanted to stay in the closet with my family, but as the man of the house, I had to do something. I grabbed my daughter's softball bat, which was lead against the corner in the closet, and gripped it hard. I slowly walked out of the room, prepared to knock the crap out of whoever was threatening my family. I rounded the corner and looked down the stairs. There, on the 3rd step up, was a woman. The woman was staring at me. Her dress was a dark, dirty gray color, and her hair was a dark black color and dripping wet. Her eyes were black, and her mouth was still. I just stood there. I couldn't do anything. After what seemed like hours of staring, the woman slowly backed down the stairs and walked out of view. Then after a few more moments, the back door shut. What the hell? I said out loud. My mind was racing. Who was that? And why the heck did she come into my house? I had never believed in the paranormal. But had I just seen a ghost? I then remembered my family was waiting for me to return. I ran back to the closet and embraced my family. It's okay. It was just Mimi, I told my daughters. I gave my wife a look, and she went along with the white lie. We sat there for a moment before everyone's adrenaline went down and the girls began to become sleepy again. We asked them if they wanted to go sleep at Mimi's and Bob's house that night, and they excitedly said yes. We packed small bags and began walking to their house. Before we left, though, I double-checked every single lock in the house. I also made sure the lady was actually gone. She was, but the water droplets she left were not. We ran over to their house quickly, terrified of what we might see outside. Luckily, we made it safely. What were you doing at our house? My daughter asked Mary. Mary glanced at my wife and I, and we gave her a look, letting her know that she needed to lie to them. I was just looking for sugar. I made cookies. They're in the kitchen, she said sweetly. The girls ran into the kitchen. Thank you, I said. Of course. So is everyone all right? Tell us what happened, Mary stated. We told Bob and Mary the story, and they were shook. They had seen the woman several times before, but never thought the woman would go inside anyone's house. That night, the girls fell asleep quickly in the living room on the floor. However, the 4 adults could not sleep a blink. We all talked about our experience, and I told everyone what I saw at the bottom of the stairs. I also told Mary and Bob my experiences from earlier that day. We tried finding information about it online, but there was nothing. The next day, we took a trip to the public library and asked if we could go through old documents. We got permission and spent all day going through files of papers. Eventually, my wife found a paper from the year 1907. The article she pointed out reported that a woman was found dead in a creek in town. The article had very little detail and didn't specify who the woman was or which creek it was. However, we allowed ourselves to believe that this was the woman who we came in contact with. After that night, we lived in constant fear. My job eventually caused us to move to Georgia, where my wife and I now live. Our daughters are both now in college and have no idea what actually happened that night. As for Bob and Mary, they lived in that house up until a year ago. Now they live in a much newer house in a different city. They have told us that they saw Margaret a couple of times since the incident. We can only hope that the woman is at rest now and will not terrorize anyone else who lives along that creek. I still have questions though, like, why did the woman need to open the door if she was a spirit? And how did she leave physical water droplets on the floor if she was just a spirit? Or maybe this wasn't a ghost at all and was just some jerk teenagers pulling a prank on us. If you have any feedback on what you think it was, please let us know. Thank you, and God bless.